My presentation is on sex trafficking, highlighting health concerns, cultural environment, and health disparities. An overview of health concerns. These victims face exposure to violence, unsafe housing situations, lack of social support, drug abuse and overdose, emotional and psychological trauma, depression, anxiety, and suicidal ideation, and sexual health concerns like STDs and STIs. Health concerns, unmet needs of victims of sex trafficking. So looking at Maslow's hierarchy of needs, physiological is met for most, but all other areas are lacking. These victims do not have a safe place. They lack love and belonging, they have poor self-esteem, and they certainly haven't met self-actualization. Media portrayal of sex trafficking definitely works against victims. There is violence against women on TV shows, movies, and video games, desensitizing people to it. Another study found that men who consume pornography are desensitized to violence toward women. Glorification of pimp culture in movies and hip-hop music. There is a limited understanding of sex trafficking. This leads to rape myths and victim blaming. Effects of inaccurate media information. It downplays the severity of sex trafficking, mistakes sex trafficking for voluntary prostitution. Because of this, less emphasis is placed on helping survivors and providing needed resources, which further endangers the population. Lack of social and family support. Many of these victims were abused or neglected as children. They had poor home lives, lack of social support. As a victim leads to depression, anxiety, aggression, suicidal ideation, and PTSD. If a support person is somewhat present in the person's life, the victim may have a greater chance of leaving their trafficker. Peer pressure, effects on health outcomes. Peer pressure can lead to sex trafficking, with promises of money, fun, and glamour. There is a great need to increase education among teens, and so they are able to recognize when something is off with a friend. Many times they may notice this more than anyone else, and it's important to know the signs of trafficking. So a Utah case study, this was presented at the 2020 Human Trafficking Symposium that I attended this year. And this case review is about a high school girl who had actually recruited other girls to be trafficked for sex for her to make her money. She targeted girls with poor self-esteem, few friends, they wanted to fit in, and she coerced them into sex trafficking. Cyclical nature of victims. Many have a poor home life, childhood abuse, and lack of social support. It's a common theme among victims. Women in these situations are more likely to be coerced into sex trafficking. And then, of course, there's this cyclical nature of drug addiction. Many of these victims end up back in the lifestyle with a trafficker because of their addiction. And then, of course, the poverty cycle plays a role in the cyclical nature of victims. Legal and political action against sex trafficking. President Trump signed an executive order allotting more money and resources to fight human trafficking as a conclusion to Human Trafficking Awareness Month, which was January of this year. As for Utah, Utah's Secure Strike Force is fighting harder than ever against human trafficking. So another Utah case review, this was April 1st, 2020. There was a trafficking bust by the Secure Strike Force just a few days ago in Ogden, Utah. 3 individuals were arrested for human trafficking when they recruited 2 17-year-old girls to be trafficked for sex out of an Ogden motel. One of the girls ended up confiding in a counselor with the Juvenile Justice Center that she was being trafficked, and that's how this case was opened. So all three of those individuals are now being prosecuted for human trafficking. Barriers that increase vulnerability. There's the stigma surrounding commercial sex and prostitution, embarrassment, high rates of drug addiction, and then fear of law enforcement and fear of the trafficker. All of these things make a victim more vulnerable. Sex trafficking, it's a worldwide problem. Victims of sex trafficking are in danger in every nation of the world. Some cultures have strong views on purity, although they actually seem to have higher rates of sex trafficking. These cultures shun survivors. For example, survivors of sex trafficking in Nepal have reported that they are looked down upon and cast out of society. Sex trafficking and socioeconomic status. A lower socioeconomic status often correlates with a poor home life, lack of parental support, abuse, neglect, and drug abuse. Higher risk of being forced or coerced into sex trafficking, sometimes by their own family. Sex trafficking and race ethnicity. So in the United States, victims have been found to be about 40% Black and 25.6% white. These are the two most commonly trafficked groups in the US. As you can see, only 13% of the total US population is Black in the United States, and 75% is white. So you can see there's a much, much higher rate in the Black population. An effect on health outcomes. Minorities are found to have poorer health outcomes in comparison to white individuals. Black victims could end up with worse outcomes, but really every racial and ethnic group is at a high risk of poor health. So I don't know if you can really have race play a part in this or not. Religion and sex trafficking. There's little research on religious beliefs of sex trafficking victims, but religion has been used as a tool of coercion with human trafficking. A study has shown that Islam, House of Judah, and Scientology have all had instances where individuals were coerced into human trafficking. This doesn't mean the religion as a whole, but just a small group within a religion used coercion and religion as a tool. Sex trafficking and gender. It's mostly women and girls, but 13% are actually men. 1 in 3 trafficked children are boys. Male victims are ashamed and less likely to seek help and treatment. So a case review at the 2020 Symposium for Human Trafficking, there was a male survivor of sex trafficking present who spoke. He was about 60 years old, and he shared his story about being trafficked at about age 7 by his mom's boyfriend. His mother was an alcoholic. She got a new boyfriend. At first he seemed great, treated the family really good. And it wasn't long before he started sexually abusing this victim. And then he started selling this boy for sex and trafficked him out of his own home. Eventually, the boy was able to get out of the situation. He grew older, he joined the military, and luckily was able to recover about as best as you can. And now he fights and supports survivors of human trafficking, and that's his mission in life. Geographical areas and sex trafficking. Washington, D.C., Atlanta, Orlando, Miami, and Las Vegas have the highest rates of sex trafficking, but it is increasing in Utah, especially with the close proximity to Las Vegas. Health outcomes for victims of sex trafficking are not good regardless of location. Just on the topic of it increasing in Utah, these are 2 of the people arrested just a few days ago being charged with sex trafficking in Utah. A role of telehealth with victims. It could be easier for a victim to seek help through telehealth. They don't need to find transportation to an appointment, and it might be easier to hide medical contact from a trafficker. Researchers have found that telehealth consultations provide better outcomes for sex abuse patients in rural areas. Biases against sex trafficked victims. They may be looked down upon for allowing themselves to be coerced into the lifestyle. They may be considered just another drug addict, dirty, infected with STDs, or looked at like a voluntary prostitute. Are there regions of the world in which these disparities would have less influence on health for this population? Not necessarily. Those trafficked in less developed nations probably have very little access to health care, and sex trafficked victims in the US have been found to access health care quite a bit while being trafficked. So the real key is closing that gap. We need healthcare providers and nurses to be able to recognize the signs of sex trafficking. In conclusion, what can you do to fight sex trafficking? First and foremost, become educated and educate others, because it's happening right in our backyard in Utah. Learn the signs and symptoms. Report anything suspicious. Just like the Secure Strike Force said when I attended the symposium, it's not our job as a nurse or a person, just in the general public to investigate a crime. So we don't have to be like, oh, I'm not sure if it's trafficking, I'm not going to report it because I don't really know. Any suspicious tip, report it, and it's their job to investigate it. Volunteer with Dahlia's Hope. Dahlia's Hope is a nonprofit organization providing aftercare services to survivors of sex trafficking. They are located in Utah and are doing some really great things in the community. Another option is to donate supplies to Dahlia's Hope. They have an animal therapy barn they're setting up right now to have horses for the girls to ride and as a therapeutic thing. So they're looking for supplies and things to furnish the house where the girls will stay. So those are just a couple options on how you can help.